The McDonnell Douglas Phantom II was a versatile fighter aircraft of the 1960s and 1970s, designed for the U.S. Navy and utilized in various roles, including fighter, interceptor, fighter bomber, reconnaissance, tanker, drone, defense suppression, and laser designator aircraft. The F-4 was the mainstay of the Western Alliance Air Forces, and during the Vietnam War, it meant American air power. A total of 5,195 Phantoms were built in 17 major variants. The Royal Australian Air Force operated the F-4E as an interim aircraft while awaiting delivery of the F-111C from 1970 to 1973. Following delays in the delivery of the F-111, Australian Defence Minister Malcolm Fraser led a team of RAAF specialists to the USA to review the F-111 program with U.S. officials. U.S. Secretary of Defense Melvin Laird was keen that Australia could meet its strategic interests in Southeast Asia and offered the F-4E Phantoms as interim strike aircraft at short notice and on very favorable terms. While the F-4E was a great combat aircraft of the 1960s, it was an all-weather fighter with a limited all-weather ground attack capability. In the strike attack roles, it could carry 12 500-pound bombs and up to 4 Sidewinder air-to-air missiles over a combat radius of 450 nautical miles without being refueled. Air-to-air refueling would extend this radius. Deputy Chief of the Air Staff at the time was Air Vice Marshal Charles Frederick Reed, who recommended the F-4E Phantom over 2 alternatives, the Grumman A-6 Intruder, a capable all-weather attack aircraft, and the British Buccaneer. Interestingly, the F-111 had a navigation bombing system with similar capabilities to that installed in the A-6 aircraft. While the F-4E had a weapons release computer system and the Buccaneer had a basic weapons delivery system, neither had a weapons system comparable to the F-111 or the A-6. U.S. technology, together with a proven combat record and weapons delivery platform, albeit visual, were better indicators of the Royal Australian Air Force preference for the F-4E while awaiting the F-111 deliveries. A leasing agreement between Defence Minister Fraser and Secretary of Defence Laird was agreed in June 1970 for 24 new aircraft from the McDonnell factory in St. Louis. The cost to Australia was in the order of $40 million Australian dollars for the lease period. Air-to-air refueling support was included in the agreement. Subject to a U.S. overriding requirement, the United States Air Force would provide in-flight refueling if a defense emergency requirement arose where Australia needed to deploy the Phantoms. Air-to-air refueling was essential, as the F-4E was limited in range and could not deploy far outside Australia without tanker support. Many Australian aircrew and ground crew selected for the F-4E project had completed training on the F-111 in 1968 and were conversant with modern weapons systems. The first crews left Australia in early July 1970. Of the original 24 navigators who trained on the F-111A at Nellis Air Force Base in 1968, only 10 remained at 82 Wing. They were the first to depart for USA to train on the weapons system at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Tucson, Arizona, in July 1970. Pilots went direct to 45 30th Tactical Training Squadron at MacDill Air Force Base in Florida, and the navigators who trained at Davis-Monthan joined them in August for flight conversion to the aircraft. Following conversion, crews picked up new F-4Es at the McDonnell Douglas factory in St. Louis before ferrying the aircraft to Amberley via George Air Force Base in California, Hickam Air Force Base in Hawaii, and Anderson Air Force Base, Guam. A mix of USAF and RAAF crews completed the ferry, with the last 2 Phantoms reaching Amberley on the 4th of October 1970. Captain Chris Patarakis from the USAF and Flight Lieutenant Lance Halvorson crewed the second-last aircraft, 97234, to reach Australia. Flight Lieutenants Brendan Roberts and Trevor Richardson were number 2 Phantom in this last Aussie flight. By the end of November 1970, the RAAF had 2 squadrons of Phantoms operating at Amberley, with minimal USAF support. Much of the ground support equipment procured for the F-111 was used, and a limited amount of test equipment came as part of what was known as the Peace Reef package. The project indicated the professional competence of the RAAF to train on a new aircraft, ferry the aircraft over the Pacific, and have 2 squadrons operational in Australia 6 months after the decision was made to lease the F-4E Phantom. The Phantoms were immediate hits with air and maintenance crews and the Australian public. During the RAAF's 50th anniversary celebrations in March 1971, the Phantoms were the crowd pullers at major air shows in 7 states. Here is ex-Wing Commander Lance Halvorson talking about the Royal Australian Air Force's experience of the Phantom.
Brutish and uncouth. People couldn't understand why it flew. It did. Great engines. Accelerate with no problems. You couldn't run to both engines up with the brakes because the tyres would rotate around the rims. The brakes couldn't hold it, in other words. If you had low fuel, you'd be doing 600 knots before the end of the runway, pull it back and climb at 85 degrees, and it'd roll over the top at about 80 knots, 35,000. It was an air interceptor, designed as an air interceptor, had a gun on it, 20mm gun, 6,000 rounds a minute. We backed it off to 4,200. It only carried 630 rounds anyway. Didn't have the range. It was not a radar bomber. It had a dive bomb. You get range, ground, air to ground ranging from the radar to feed into the weapons computer release, into the weapons release computer, and the pilot would pull 4G and the bomb would come off automatically in a mode called dive toss. But the aircraft was not, I couldn't bomb at night in all weather because you couldn't see the target. The radar was no good for that. The 111 was a ground mapping attack radar. The F4 was an air intercept radar. Great for picking up targets, but that's what it was designed for. But it was not a ground all-weather capability that we wanted. But it was great day attack aircraft. We flew everywhere in that 4-ship formation. 111s, we only flew 1, sometimes 2. At night, solo. F4s everywhere day, 4-ship. Great gutsy ground attack aircraft. That's all it was. As in great air interceptor, we didn't buy it for that. But it was a good technology introduction to us from the Canberra 111. Then we had to come back to the Canberra before we got the 111. It was a great introduction to the Air Force to manage a new technology, high technology aircraft with all its limitations. People wanted to keep it, but it didn't do what we wanted. We wanted an all-weather strike capability, which the 111 had and the Phantom didn't. Couldn't fly to Perth via Alice Springs to get out of the headwinds across the Bight with a big 600-gallon tank. That was about it. When we travelled with it, long ferry, we always carried 2 370-gallon tanks on the wingtips, travelled anywhere, a big 600-gallon tank as well. And that's how we ferried the aircraft back from the States.
From a pilot perspective, the F-4E was wonderful to fly and operate. The high thrust-weight ratio, with afterburners on the GE J79 engine, gave excellent acceleration. The 8.5 G limit, multiple heavy weapons loads, and integrated air-to-air and air-to-ground radar navigation systems were major technology leaps for crews who were used to the basic systems in the Canberra and Sabre. As in all two-crew aircraft, teamwork between the pilot and navigator in the planning and air phases of a mission is the key to success. Management of the weapons systems was a continual challenge to improve weapons delivery accuracy, and post-flight analysis by air and ground crews paid dividends. The serviceability rates achieved by the RAAF far exceeded that of many similar USAF units. Air-to-ground gunnery with the nose-mounted GE M61 Vulcan 20mm gun was a new experience to many. A typical pattern was entered at 4,000 feet, followed by a low-angle, 15-degree descent, opening fire at 1,800 feet, and cease firing at 1,200 feet slant range. A yaw string on the nose in front of the pilot assisted in balancing the aircraft for weapons release or gun firing. The gun had 6,000 rounds per minute rate of fire, with a rounds limiter switch. rate of fire could be reduced to about 4,500. Crews used all the bombing modes, including dive, skip, dive toss, and level radar, but the most accurate was the dive toss, which required a radar lock-on to ground return for ranging for the computer, which calculated the release point, as the pilot initiated a 4G pullout. The RAAF used the Phantom primarily in the strike role, although most sorties included training in the air-to-air role. Crews practiced dive bombing from 30 to 60 degrees. The Phantom did, however, suffer from an adverse yaw problem. At high angles of attack when aileron was applied, the aircraft would turn the opposite direction and depart controlled flight. The solution was to use rudder only, which took a bit of getting used to. In a tight turn about 5 to 6 G to reverse the turn, it was a boot full of top, or bottom depending on the circumstances, rudder and hold the back stick. The aircraft would really whip around, so crews had to be on their toes. Pilot-induced oscillations brought on by control inputs out of synchronization with aircraft movements often produced a vicious, unplanned change of flight direction. Excessive power changes resulted in rapid trim changes with similar results. Landing the Phantom was like any other Century Series aircraft. Normal practice was to maintain speed around 125 to 130 knots of indicated airspeed and fly at a constant angle of attack, no round-out, until touchdown. Boundary layer control improved the low-speed handling of the aircraft. Ground effect and rounding out did flatten the approach slightly. The drag chute was very effective, and often pilots would need power to make the turnoff before dropping the chute. Nose wheel steering was engaged at 70 knots of indicated airspeed. The E-model brakes were very effective, and with good judgment, the aircraft could easily stop in 1,500 feet. The first major incident with Phantoms in the RAAF occurred with aircraft number 97234 on the 19th of October 1970. On its first flight in Australia after arriving from USA, the flight lead aircraft flown by Flight Lieutenant Jack Ellis suffered a left generator failure and malfunctioning bus tie contactor. As a result, the brake anti-skid system and nose wheel steering were not available. As there was a prevailing 15-knot crosswind, normal USAF procedure with these systems inoperative was to fly an approach-end engagement of the hook cable. USAF instructor pilots in the Amberley Tower recommended the same action. Following touchdown, at about 150 knots of indicated airspeed, the hook engaged the cable on the runway center line. As the nose wheel trampled the cable oscillated, and together with slack in the cable, caused the cable to come off the drum, run out, and break. The Phantom yawed to the right and ran off the runway before yawing back left when the left main wheel hit soft dirt. The cable whipped back around the aircraft, damaging the external tanks, landing gear doors, and the radome. In addition, the aircraft suffered extensive damage to the front fuselage, right wing, and left and nose landing gear structures. The aircraft was repaired by 3 AD in 11 months. The major repair was replacement of the right wing, the first time a depot repair task of such magnitude was carried out on a Phantom by any Air Force maintenance crews. Unfortunately, the RAAF lost an F-4E and crew on the night of the 16th of June 1971 near Evans Head bombing range in New South Wales. Following a bombing detail and on clearing the range to the north, the crew was completing a visual rejoin on the flight lead when radio contact was lost. Squadron leader Stu Fisher and Flight Lieutenant Rob Waring were tragically lost in the accident. The following day, wreckage was positively identified as being from the missing Phantom. 2 years after arriving in Australia, the first 12 of the RAAF F-4Es left Australia on the 4th of November 1972, with the final 11 departing in June 1973. Most of the 23 Phantoms returned to USA were modified to F-4G Wild Weasel versions for electronic warfare and continued flying until the USAF retired the type in the late 90s. Nearly all the remaining XRAAF tail numbers were modified to QF-4 drones and employed as targets or are stored at the Aerospace Maintenance and Regeneration Center at Davis-Monthan Air Force Base in Arizona. The RAAF crews who were fortunate to have been involved with the Phantom remember the years with pride and satisfaction of having flown one of the world's great fighters. The aircraft certainly introduced the RAAF into the American way of the fast, high-technology fighter-bomber with advanced systems. Unfortunately, it did not have the capability that the RAAF required in an all-weather strike aircraft that the F-111 would provide from June 1973.